Welcome to Train Salem, the continuation of the Windows Server 2012 Advanced Services course. In this lesson, we're exploring validating digital certificates. You've heard the expression that, the more things change, the more they stay the same. It's a way of saying that overall, things tend to be more or less the same all the time, and even the change is just part of continuing an ongoing process. Well, I'm going to take that phrase and flip it on its head for a moment for you. And I'm going to suggest that in order for things to stay the same, we need to be able to accommodate the change. That changes will come, and in order to continue running a smoothly operating IT operation, I need to be able to account for changes in my organization. As that applies to digital certificates, I need to deal with a number of ongoing changes that happen in my environment. I don't just set up a CA, deploy certificates, and then everything runs fine smoothly from that point. I do need to accommodate a certain number of changes that occur in that environment on a regular basis. Specifically, as it applies to certificates, from time to time certificates will be renewed. I need to be able to accommodate getting those out to those who need them and informing consumers of certificates that describe my CAs themselves that the CAs have revved a new certificate. And I also need to deal with the important challenge of certificate revocation. Whenever a computer is presented with a certificate and is asked to use it for some purpose, part of using that certificate entails validating that that certificate is still in fact usable. And there's a couple of reasons it might not be. Certificates are only usable for a certain period of time, and then I have to stop using them or renew them. It could well be that that certificate has been revoked, that the use of that certificate by that individual has been denied for one of a variety of interesting reasons. So, for example, I was sitting here at the GlobalMantics help desk when I got a phone call that one of our programmers had been let go. Poor guy apparently ran up a big phone bill using the company phone to vote for his favorite couple on Dancing with the Microsoft Technical Fellows. I mean, I'm a big fan of Mark Russinovich too, but $800 worth of phone bills, we had to let him go. So that means we need to revoke the digital certificate for code signing that this programmer was using to be able to build his code. The certificate is tied to his existence as a person affiliated with our organization. Now that he's no longer tied to our organization, that certificate no longer accurately describes him as an employee of our company. We should revoke that certificate. So for illustration purposes, let me jump over to my CA and revoke this programmer's certificate. So here I am on Dallas Server 2. This is my certificate authority. Let me go visit the list of certificates that have been issued in the past. And I see a couple of them here. One for Nelson. In one of our other lessons, we issued a GlobalMantics contractor certificate to Nelson. He's a contract employee. And here I've got a certificate for Richard Spivey. Richard is the programmer. He was using a GlobalMantics programmer certificate. Now that's unique to this environment here. That certificate won't be in your system necessarily. That was a certificate that I published a template for, and then Richard enrolled for the certificate as he became an employee. But now that he's no longer with us, let's move on to other important career opportunities. We're going to right-click that certificate and choose to revoke that certificate. It says, are you sure you want to do that? And why do you want to do that? And we've got a number of different reasons. The one that we never want to have to choose, but we might, is CA compromise. A CA compromise might occur when some hacker manages to compromise one of my CAs and trick that server into generating a certificate necessary to validate the usage of a CA run by the bad guy. Suddenly now the bad guy can issue certificates that look like my company is willing to claim ownership of them. Well, I can revoke certificates because the CA was compromised or that key was compromised. In this case, we're just revoking an individual cert, so that might be a more likely case. The user inadvertently leaked the private key to somebody else. That's a good time to revoke that certificate because the secret is out. In this case, with an employee who's gone on to greener pastures, we're going to issue a change of affiliation based revocation. The user is no longer affiliated with our company. Because of that change of affiliation, we're going to revoke that certificate. You know, the certificate vanishes out of my list. Now if I go look in the list of revoked certificates, there is that certificate. Who was the requester? The requester was Richard Spivey, who is no longer with the firm. Now here's an interesting question. If somebody wanted to know that Richard's certificate got revoked, how would they determine that? Where does the information about this revocation go? To be able to answer that, we need to define a couple of new terms for our use of our certificate server. Let me jump back to my slides and I'll illustrate that point. Among the other important details that are contained within the certificates that I build, in addition to all the other useful information about a certificate, the security settings, the subject name configuration, issuance rules, all those things, in addition to all of that, a certificate inherits two pieces of information from the CA that issues the certificate, something called an AIA and something called a CDP. The job of the AIA, the Authority Information Access extension, is to describe for a certificate where a place exists that someone validating that certificate can go to determine that the certificate associated with the CA itself has been updated. From time to time, a certificate for a CA itself needs to get renewed. When that happens, those who want to be able to validate certificates that come from that CA need to get their hands on that updated certificate. Well, where does it live? Well, it turns out we're going to configure that information on our CA in such a way that all of the consumers of certificates of those CAs will see that that information is embedded in each certificate issued by that certificate authority. CDP is the other side of that. The C in CDP really is short for CRL, the Certificate Revocation List. So what's the DP part? The DP is a distribution point. So this is a CRL distribution point, or Certificate Revocation List distribution point configuration setting. It's going to identify where I would go to retrieve the information about whether or not a certificate has been revoked. We just revoked a certificate for Richard Spivey, but where would we go to learn the fact that that happened? How does a local client inside of my network determine that? How, indeed, does a computer outside of my corporate network learn that interesting piece of information? So let me show you where we actually configure those settings. So here we are back on Dallas Server 2, and for illustration purposes, let me go back and open up the details of this certificate that I revoked. I'm going to throw a double click at it. I could alternatively, I suppose, right click and choose Open. It'll do the same thing. And that'll open the window that shows me the details of how that certificate is configured. On the first tab, I can see that this was indeed a software publishing certificate issued by the Dallas Server 2 CA. Looks good. On the Details tab, I've got a number of interesting pieces of information about the CA. The serial number, which hashing algorithm is used to calculate hashes, validity dates, things of that sort, and something called a CDP, a CRL distribution point. And just below that, an AIA, an Authority Information Access. And we can see here that the AIA and the CDP are both referencing locations inside of Active Directory. I've got a location identifier here that references an LDAP location. And what we're looking at here is an LDAP distinguished name, an LDAP DN. Specifically, we're looking inside of our domain, globalmantics.local, looking inside of the configuration partition. Those of you who are Active Directory nerds know that Active Directory is not just one database of information exactly, it's partitioned into a number of logical chunks. The main body of it, the domain naming context, or default naming context, is the container that contains user accounts and computers and groups and shared folders and things of that sort. This is a different partition of the database. The configuration partition contains information about the behavior of the environment, but not about a particular user or a particular computer or a particular group, things of that sort. Inside of that container is a services container, inside of which is a public key services container, inside of which is a container called CDP. Inside the CDP container is a reference to globalmantics-Dallas Server 2 CA. If I look at the AIA field, I can see that similarly it's storing information about itself as an AIA in that same location, inside of the configuration partition of my globalmantics.local Active Directory domain. If you're feeling curious, you can actually go look inside of your domain controller and go validate that that data exists where it seems to with the use of the tool called ADSI-Edit, the Active Directory Services Interface Editor. does allow you to have a graphical view of all parts of the database. Active Directory users and computers, of course, focuses just on the default naming context, the home of the user accounts and OUs and such. So the next important question is, how did that data get there? Where did the certificate learn that that is a valid location to store updated certificates for the certificate server, as well as CRLs, certificate revocation lists? That information comes from the configuration of the CA as a whole, and let me take a moment to show it to you. I'm going to OK my certificate window, and I'm going to right-click my certificate server as a whole, not any one of the subfolders, and pull up its properties. And among the list of tabs here in the properties of my CA is a tab labeled Extensions, inside of which I've got two different extensions that I can configure, CDP and AIA. For each of these, you'll see that there's a series of locations where a CRL can live, or in the case of an AIA, where a CA certificate can live, locations from which those useful pieces of data can be retrieved. You'll note that in both cases we've got a range of different ways to be able to store and access that kind of information, including a local path. I've got AIA information at C Windows System 32 cert serve / certificate enrollment / name of the server _ name of the CA followed by name of the certificate in question .CRT. This computer is planning to store information about that CA certificate locally here on this computer in that particular file, in that particular location. The things inside of angled brackets, the less than, greater than signs here, are variables of a sort. They get automatically replaced with the actual CA name, actual server name, things of that sort, when they're actually evaluated by the CA. Let me look at that same option here under CDP. C Windows System 32 cert serve cert enroll, name of the CA, name of the CRL suffix, identification of whether the Delta CRL is allowed or not. We haven't talked about Delta CRLs yet. .CRL, certificate revocation list. Now, why we've got these local locations here? This is actually storing information locally in the file server of the CA itself. It turns out that's on purpose. The CA does itself consult its own certificate revocation lists for a certain number of situations. So whatever else you do with your CDP and your AIA settings, Microsoft recommends leaving that option alone. Don't change it. Take a look at the next option. LDAP, CN equals CA truncated name, CRL name suffix, CN equals server short name, CN equals CDP, public key services. Does that look familiar at all? It should. This is the URL that we saw in the certificate that I revoked for Richard Spivey. It's because of this piece of information that we are storing the CRL that now contains information about Richard's certificate revocation in Active Directory. Now, that's an extremely logical place to put information. Active Directory serves as a central clearinghouse for all sorts of useful information. Why wouldn't we put CRLs in Active Directory? But in some cases, I want to make sure that they're available in other places too. I've got options to configure a HTTP server location, web server. I can configure some other kind of file path. I can click my Add button here to identify other additional locations where I want to be able to store that file. And I've got my choice of an HTTP path, web server, LDAP path, which is, say, a directory service like Active Directory. I can supply a UNC, a local path, and I've got access to the complete list of variables, the pieces of data that describe the particular certificate, the particular server, whatever. So I don't need to configure a long list of similar entries. I can describe them by way of a pattern here, and when it becomes useful, the CA plugs in the correct values where these variables sit. So in this case, I'm going to build an HTTP location where I'm going to store a certificate over on Dallas Server 3. Here we're on Dallas Server 2, which is the CA in my Dallas office. Dallas Server 3 is a web server here in the Dallas office. Dallas Server 2 is a CA. Dallas Server 3 is a web server in my DMZ. It's there to service external clients, people who are out there in the internet who want to be able to resolve for people out there in the internet who want to resolve the question of whether or not my certificates are valid. So to answer that question, they're going to connect to Dallas Server 3 / certificate distribution point / GlobalMantic CRL .crl. Looks good. Be careful typing your URL. One of the most routine challenges I run into when working with CAs of this sort is mistyping, irritatingly, this piece of information. It's really easy to do, and if you do, lots of things don't work the way they're supposed to. So if you're seeing funny behavior where it seems like people aren't getting the CRL they're supposed to, or not getting updates of information about a certificate that's revved on a CA, go double check that your URLs are spelled correctly. It's really easy to mistype them. So now I'm going to go configure the same behavior for the AIA field. And I'm going to go add an entry here, and that's going to be an HTTP reference. It's also going to refer to my Dallas Server 3 computer. In the certificate distribution point directory, AIA.CRT. It's going to be a certificate. Looks good. Now I could, of course, have dropped in variables if I needed to. In this case, I don't. We'll call that good and click OK. So we've configured an AIA and a CDP. Now, some of you are probably already noticing the error. I created here a folder called certificate disp point. I don't know if I was thinking dispensation or what. And my AIA is dist point. So there I've already proved the fact that it's really easy to mistype these things. I did it right here in this demonstration. Now, one irritating feature of AIAs and CDPs is that once I've added it, I can't directly edit it. If I mistype something, as I did here in the case of my CDP, I can't select it and right-click and edit. I have to throw it away and build a new one. So that's what I'm going to do. HTTP, Dallas Server 3, certificate distribution point / GlobalMantics CRL.CRL. So there's my CDP configuration. There's my AIA configuration. Looks good. That being done, we've now added those locations to the places that we're going to store a copy of the CRL or the AIA, as the case may be. CRLs are rolled out on a scheduled basis. I can see the details of that if I OK this window. Do I want to restart ADCS to put those changes into effect? Sure I do. It's a fairly meaningful change. We're changing the behavior of every certificate that will be issued from this CA going forward. To be able to see the behavior of certificate revocation, I'm going to go right-click the Revoked Certificates node in my MMC and pull up its properties. You'll note that that's one of only a few elements of the Certificate Authority tool that support that behavior. If I right-click Issued Certificates, if I right-click Pending Requests, if I right-click Failed Requests, none of those have properties. Certificate Templates has the ability to go launch the Certificate Templates tool to refresh, to be able to issue a template. We talked about that in a different lesson. But none except for Revoked Certificates has a Properties option. If I open up the Properties of my Revoked Certificates node, we can see that we can specify a CRL publication interval. How often do I want to take the information about the certificates that have been revoked on my server and publish a complete new full-size CRL, sometimes called a base CRL, containing the complete list of all certificates that have ever been revoked on this server. By default here we're seeing 1 week. I might consider adjusting that number up or down if necessary. Beneath that is an option to publish what are called Delta CRLs. And Delta CRLs are a somewhat more efficient form of certificate revocation communication, inasmuch as a Delta CRL only contains the changes since the last time that a base CRL was published. Client computers attempting to validate a certificate can consult a Delta CRL and see what's happened recently. If something's not in the recent list, it's likely that the client machine already knows about those changes. But if not, it'll catch it at the update of the next main base CRL. I can even use this interface to go see which CRLs are currently looking like on this server. And I can go view my current certificate revocation list. There's the details of the CRL itself, and here is the revocation list with the list of revoked certificates in that main list. Likewise, I can go look at my Delta CRL, and I can see what happened since last time I published a base CRL. If I'm not willing to wait for the next publishing of the certificate revocation list, I can force the issue by right-clicking Revoked Certificates and choosing deliberately to Publish. So the dialog box pops up to identify whether I'm publishing a new CRL or just a Delta. Again, these things will happen on a scheduled basis anyway, but in this case, let me publish a brand new CRL, a new base CRL. In clicking OK, we've now pushed that certificate revocation list to all the various locations configured in the CDP for that CA. This is very important day-to-day maintenance or maybe week-to-week maintenance on a certificate authority server. Those who consume the certificates that I make available from the CA need to have some degree of confidence that the certificates that they are working with are valid. And that only works if they can call the CA back when they're about to use the certificate and say, hey, is this certificate still valid? Is there anything wrong with it? You may be aware of situations where you've gone to visit a website and that website throws up an error message that says, the certificate on this website appears to be invalid. Well, what's happening there? Your client computer is trying to contact the CA that issued that certificate and say, hey, is this still valid? Can I still trust this? And is running into some problem doing so. Could be a misconfiguration of some sort on the part of the people who set up the CA. Hopefully that won't be you, because of course you took a class with TrainSignal, so you're educated about these sorts of things. But that useful ability now triggers a problem of its own. And the problem is that I'm now producing a progressively longer and longer certificate revocation list. And when a user out there in the internet is trying to use one of the certificates that I've supplied to them, when they want to find out, is that certificate valid, they have to download a progressively longer and longer and longer CRL to identify if their certificate was revoked or not. That can become a performance problem over a period of time, and certainly puts an increasing amount of strain on the certificate server itself. Fortunately, there's a way to improve upon that. I can deploy something called an online responder. Online responders are servers configured to use something called the Online Certificate Status Protocol, OCSP. And the goal of OCSP is to allow a client computer that's looking at one of my certificates to issue a simple request that says, hey, I don't need the whole certificate revocation list, but how about this certificate? Is this certificate valid? This is a great idea. I don't know why we didn't do it back when Windows 2000 came out, but okay. My client's going to go call an online responder. The online responder is probably sitting out in my DMZ. It's in a network that's reachable from the internet, but does not have unguarded access to my corporate network. It then sends a request in through the corporate firewall to my certificate server, or whichever server houses a copy of my CRL. And it's able to ask the question, hey, this particular certificate, is it valid? Can I trust this certificate to be usable? When the response comes back, the online responder is able to return that information and just that information back to the client. The client receives much less data than they used to when they would retrieve an entire CRL, and we reduce stress on the overall system. This can be a very useful thing to do in cases where there's a lot of certificate validation traffic targeting my CAs. And fortunately, setting up an online responder is pretty straightforward. Let me go deploy one on Dallas Server 3. So here I am on Dallas Server 3. Server 3 is just another server here in the Dallas office. I want to make sure that it's set up to be able to be an online responder. Well, that is a role service. It's not a feature. It's not a standalone helper of some role, in a sense. It is a part of the Active Directory Certificate Services role. So I'm going to do a role-based installation onto this server, Dallas Server 3. Deploying certificate services functionality. I don't need to deploy any particular features at this particular point. I'm going to click Next, and we're now prepared to roll out this particular piece of certificate services. Now, one thing I should point out while I'm here. One other important part of the use of the online responder is the fact that that feature is going to be available through HTTP. It's going to be a web-driven interface. So it is going to be important that IIS be installed. And in fact, Microsoft suggests when you're installing an OCSP, it's generally best if you let it install IIS at the same time. In this case, I've already got an IIS server there. So I would have to be a little bit more manual in configuring that. But if you let the IIS installation happen at the same time that you install the online responder, it's going to automatically configure IIS to accommodate the online responder functionality. So I'm just going to go ahead and click Next and Next because I didn't have any features to install. It's now telling me that I'm preparing to install a piece of Active Directory Certificate Services. It wants to know which one. I don't need another CA. What I need is an online responder. And as I do that, it's going to ask me if I want the configuration tools. Do I want to configure the online responder tools? That makes sense to me. Let me go ahead and add those. And click Next. I'm going to click Install, and off we go. And let's see, that's going to take a minute or two. Let me feed some extra cheese to the trained hamsters under the desk here that run the servers. There you go, little guy. Okay, that's better. Now we're moving. And there we go. We're installed. And for the animal lovers in the group, I can assure you that no hamsters were harmed in the making of this video. So having installed the online responder feature, I do also need to take a moment to configure it. My little warning symbol up here at the top of my Server Manager window indicates to me that I have some configuration yet to do. So that pops up my little tile that tells me that post configuration is required for my Active Directory Certificate Services role. So let me go ahead and click that link. That again invites me to confirm my credentials that will allow me to do this installation. In this case, we are just installing an online responder, which merely needs local administrator's permissions. So my Dallas Server 3 administrator permissions are going to be just fine for that purpose. Which feature am I configuring? Online responder. I don't have a choice. I didn't install any of the other components. To configure, I click Configure. Configuration succeeded. Everything's good to go. Having done that, if I go to the Tools menu and go visit the Online Responder Management feature, my Online Responder tool appears, and I can configure details of in what way I want this particular feature to respond to incoming CRL verifications. Going into detail on that configuration is a little beyond our scope, but it's good to know that that's there. There's another important detail to making an online responder work, and it relates to an idea of certificate template publishing of the sort that we talked about in a different lesson. If you haven't reviewed the lesson on how to manage certificate templates, that's a good warm-up for what we're going to talk about right here, but I'm going to assume that you've seen that. So I'm going to close my online responder interface. In fact, I'm going to go back to Server 2 and configure my main certification authority interface over there. So back here on Server 2, I'm going to go to my certificate templates collection. Observing that the certificate that I want to deploy isn't in this list, I'm going to go right-click Certificate Templates and Manage to drop down into the Certificate Templates tool. And what I want to do is I want to configure the computer, Dallas Server 3, my online responder, with an OCSP response signing certificate. The presence of that certificate will officially authorize Dallas Server 3 to be an online responder, an OCSP connection point. So, as per our usual pattern, I'm going to right-click and duplicate that template. I'm going to give it a friendly name. I'm going to make this the GlobalMantics OCSP response signing certificate. And I want to configure security in such a way as to ensure that that computer account will be able to auto-enroll for that certificate. You saw in the lesson on generating certificates and publishing templates that it's possible for a user to manually enroll for a certificate. Well, computers can't do that. They have to do it in some automated fashion. So auto-enroll is the right logical thing to do in the case of a computer certificate. But to which user or group should I assign it? I could go add the computer account for Dallas Server 3 to this list and assign the auto-enroll permission to that. That would be very good and very specifically targeted. In this case, I can take something of a shortcut by simply assigning it to authenticated users. Because interestingly, the authenticated users group not only contains a list of all the user accounts in that domain, It also includes all of the computer accounts. The one exception to the all users statement there, of course, is the guest account. Guest is part of everyone, the everyone group, but it's not part of authenticated users. Having done that, I've set up the environment in which my computer will be able to auto-enroll for a certificate, assuming, of course, I've configured group policy to allow for auto-enrollment on the computer configuration half of a relevant GPO. But again, that's a subject that we saw in a different lesson. So with all that, we've now accomplished the ability to let consumers of our certificates be able to validate that those certificates are still valid, to be able to know why they've been revoked if they're in fact revoked. Those clients are now able to retrieve updated CA certificates if the CA certificate goes through a renewal process. These are vitally necessary tasks to maintaining your public key infrastructure. I hope that this lesson will serve you well as you continue administering your Windows Server 2012 environment. There's lots more to come in other lessons in this course.